Welcome to Kairos Research Center podcast, Christian faith seeking understanding, intellectual witness, and spiritual renewal.
Let's continue to dwell further on the subject of inerrancy as defined and defended. It's very clear by now that we have affirmed inerrancy without compromise. Now, one natural reaction to the claim of inerrancy is to deny it and to attack it. There must be error, and plenty according to the skeptics. They say, and they know what they do? They give us a long list of Bible contradictions and difficulties. And seems very impressive, no? Actually, these lists were not originally created by the critics. Because now Christian believers through the ages have been noting them down, recording them down. So let's be clear, when the critics come to you and say, the Bible contains A, contains B, A contradicts B, what do? They didn't discover it, What they do is they just read, what the Christians have already listed out and attempted to answer. But instead of reading the answer, they just throw the question at you and let you sweat, trying to give the answers. So there are two books at the end, one by Gleason Archer and the other one by Geisler and Nix on Bible difficulties or when critic asks. So I recommend you buy them. I will talk more about it later. So all these difficulties that claim to be undermining inerrancy have already been noted and dealt with and satisfactorily answered by our early Christian scholars. So with that in mind, I would say our task now is to address the claim of contradiction head on. Not relying on linguistic acrobatics to give desperate solutions, but to lay out the proper framework dealing with the difficulties and demonstrate with a few examples to why we are justified. Instead of calling them contradiction, we call them alleged contradiction when we approach them with the right methodological presupposition or framework. The question is, what are the facts in context? What are the facts in context? So let's look at all these what I would say reasons why they seem to be alleged discrepancies in the Bible, especially when you compare Kings and Chronicles or the Synoptic Gospels. What are some of the origins of these apparent discrepancies? Well, sometimes the revelation is given, not sometimes in very ancient times, and by written in different perspective. The writer, compiler of the book Kings and Chronicles have different perspective. In Chronicles, it's very temple-centered, you may want to say. And we in turn, we have limited access to everything in the context. So sometimes we have the wrong expectation, and when our questions are not answered, we say there are errors or discrepancy. And I would say there is also the expectation of exact repetition. When you read in the Synoptic Gospel, the critics say, you see, they all plagiarize one another. That is a modern practice that was not to be imported without a careful recognition that we are talking the different contexts. And so recognize the different personalities, the different approach of the writers. For example, Matthew is very systematic in how he structured the book. Mark is writing the gospel from a man of action to the Romans. Luke was a careful researcher, emphasizing on the humanity of Christ. So you have different principles and different methods of arrangement at play when we have the text laid out in front of us. We need to keep those in mind. And also, I would say something that it may be surprising to some of you who think that because I support inerrancy, therefore I ignore the errors in the manuscript. Actually, when you read the books of Kings and Chronicles and Samuel, some of the discrepancies in matters, especially on numbers, are very hard to reconcile. They don't seem possible. Sometimes, having exhausted the different possible explanation, we come down and say, we think that these texts here that we have, in the present manuscript we have, they contain errors. But we cannot resolve them now because the manuscript is not available, the original. So, we acknowledge there are errors in the present manuscripts. So because the way the numbering was done in the old times, and because old manuscript as much, so it's not impossible. So I will say, contrary to Michael Berg, I don't ignore these things. I acknowledge that there could be manuscript issues that we still have to live with. Okay? So now, let us bear in mind that the originals be not available, the current manuscript we have could be corrupted, and in some cases, and thankfully not many, there still remains some discrepancy in terms of numbers. Okay. Then secondly, when we talk about inerrancy, let's bear in mind that what Scripture affirm and what Scripture assert is different things. Sometimes Scripture describe the action of one of the protagonists, about Samson and all his wild doings. It doesn't mean that Scripture is condoning the decisions, the actions of Samson. It's just describing one of the protagonists. So let us not judge Scripture wrongly because it merely describes the action of the protagonist, you want to say. So sometimes we also attribute errors to Scripture based on different cultural expectations. For example, how come Achan in Joshua, whole family was wiped out, you know? Achan is Chinese, Achan, the only Chinese there. So, no, one more actually. So anyway, I'm joking. So, we have different cultural practices and expectations now, and we therefore wrongly judge Scripture because we have different cultural sensibilities. I'll give an example. In 2 Kings 2:23-24, Elijah was mocked by so-called children, and then God sent some she-bears to maul them because supposedly they were making fun of his bald-headedness, very dangerous, to criticize, to make fun of bald-headed people, just to remind you. But what's actually happening? You need to look at the text. Sometimes when you want to deal with question of inerrancy, for example, they were not mocking any ordinary people, they were mocking a prophet. If you dare to mock God's mouthpiece in those days, like you're mocking God, and they were not innocent children. The word Hebrew is not just innocent children. They were young men. You may say something like more the modern street gang, you might want to say, And then when mock is bald-headed, the way it's put sometimes is insinuating that he was a leper who has shaved his head. And so they were mocking God's prophet as though he is a detestable outcast. And so the whole thing is not that Elisha went after them, but God rightly brought judgment upon such people when they placed in front of them is none other than God's spokesman. So what I want to say is an example that very often we are too quick to jump to a conclusion about errors in the Bible. But we need to take into account the context. I'll give you one more example. When Jesus said the mustard is the smaller seed, now with the invention of the telescope, microscope, they're smaller seed than the mustard. But of course, you must see what was the intention. It was the smaller seed in the conversation at that time, and so Jesus was using it to express a certain point. If you have seed as small as a mustard seed, you can work miracles. Or we also need to bear in mind other contexts. For example, Joshua in the battle, when Moses prayed, the sun stood still. Did the earth stop rotating? Did the sun stop moving? From the point of view of modern physics, this is highly impossible. But perhaps we must be open to the fact that the Scripture is now describing what is phenomenological rather than physics. Is it possible that the sun's ray continues to shine despite being over the horizon? I don't know, but God could have make some arrangement that the sunlight is reflected beyond the horizon so that light still remains. Now, granted, this is speculation. The whole point is, if you treat the text like physics text, then you're mistaken. The Bible is phenomenological, you might want to say. And so this is the province of hermeneutics, properly reading the text in context, okay? Now, earlier I talked about some common mistakes. Let me just say some more common mistakes that is involved when people allege discrepancy. You assume that unexplained is not explainable. You assume that if it fails to understand the context, very often the people, the critics will interpret obscure passages, ignore the light from the clear ones. Sometimes when Scripture is not clear, it will be lights will be shaded if you refer to a parallel passage which is clearer. It assumes the partial report is a false report. This is especially true in terms of the resurrection accounts, which we have done before. And same thing, it assumes that they seem to be divergent accounts, then they must all be false. Same thing, we have treated that when we dealt with the issue of the revelation of Jesus Christ. So it forgets that the Bible uses non-technical language and everyday language, like so many critics who attribute errors in the book of Genesis. Okay, it assumes a round number of false. Actually, when you read the book both Exodus and the Pentateuch, they are used round numbers. So it assumes that the citation of the Old Testament must be exact quotation. I've mentioned that earlier. And finally, it forgets that only the original text and not every copy of scripture is without error. So, yes, let us take care of the context with proper hermeneutics. Let us be mindful of mistakes that the critics also commit in their eagerness to discover errors in scripture. And so, at the end, what I'm saying, yes, there are difficulties encountered when we interpret scripture, but errors, no, that will not be the case. Okay, so now let us look a bit more carefully how further understanding of the way scripture is written may help us avoid jumping too soon to the conclusion that there's error in the Bible. For example, when it comes to chronology, sometimes there's flexibility in how the writers arranges the chronology. I'll deal with that in one of the errors afterwards. And sometimes Jesus repeats his words in different contexts. So when you have the writers having the liberty to rearrange the chronology of the text, unlike us moderns, or sometimes when Jesus speaks the same word in preaching in different contexts, he spent 3 years walking up and down talking. No surprise, he repeated the same words in different occasions, and likewise recorded in different occasions in different events. So let us not jump to the conclusion that there is contradiction and error. Okay, so let me give you some case study, therefore, just to highlight what I'm talking about, put some concreteness to it. One example: are there 2 temple cleansing or 1 temple cleansing? John put the temple cleansing early in the gospel. Matthew and Luke put the cleansing later. So, did John and Matthew and Luke conflict one another, or were there 2 cleansings? Some scholars are very keen to say that there are 2 cleansings. Like, how many times did Peter deny Jesus? But I would say, while I'm not close to that, I would recognize first of all that John was more thematic than chronological in his arrangement of the gospel. And in that regard, putting the temple destruction earlier in the cleansing, earlier in the gospel fits the context, because when Jesus say the word became flesh and tabernacled among us, John 1:40, and he fulfills the prophecy that God's glory is going to return to his temple in Malachi 1:3, and that he's the Passover lamb. So all this is very appropriate, because now God has returned to the temple, and Jesus will be destroyed. The temple will be destroyed, but he will be raised. So that Jesus, as an indwelling of God, the temple that God has returned to his people in Malachi 3:1, he will be raised up. So all this fit nicely in John's beginning chapters, and so he just put it there because it's appropriate. So you may say Matthew and Luke were putting it chronologically, but John was putting it, you may say, topically. Okay. Now, there is flexibility in ordering as well. I show you this little chart, which follows the events of the ordination of disciples. Matthew, there are 3 events: ordination of disciples, Pharisees reproof, and man with the withered hand healed. This is Matthew. Look at the chart. Whereas the Mark, you find the Pharisees were reproved, the man with the withered hand healed, ordination of disciples. Now, is this a contradiction? But I'm putting this to alert you to be mindful that the writers had no problem in being flexible in ordering the disciples. So what happened is, I think in Matthew's case, the ordination of the disciples was in a very solemn occasion when Jesus was appointing new apostles. There will be coming persecution, and so therefore he grouped it together, and only then he talks about the Pharisees and the men with the withered hand. So I think you may say, let us be mindful. Sometimes when the critics point out and say there's contradiction, no. Let's ask, what is Matthew trying to do? When he group it this way, and Matthew and Luke group it differently, there is flexibility in ordering of events. Okay. Then another favorite example raised by critics is the genealogy of Christ. You'll find when you compare the genealogy of Christ between Matthew and Luke, and up to the King David, then you seem to have different ancestral lists for Jesus given by Matthew and by Luke, you might want to say. There are 3 or 4 explanation given, including levirate marriage, legal father, and so on. But I think generally, satisfactory harmonization or understanding we can arrive at if we just bear in mind that Matthew's case refers to the father, Joseph, the legal father of Jesus. That's the line from Joseph onwards. And Luke gives the line from Mary onwards. So Mary has a line before her, Joseph has a line. So Matthew is the paternal genealogy, Luke is the maternal genealogy, and naturally the lists don't coincide with one another. So this is a good enough explanation. So, but you have to do your homework lah to go into detail. I'm just pointing them out to you. One more possibility: the temptation of Jesus. The order is different, no? So, and I think in Luke's case, he was at the temple. I think the temptation. So you would say that more likely the case is in Matthew's case the temptation was described chronologically, but in Luke's case the temptations were arranged climatically. So again, you see, there is flexibility. Don't be too quick to accuse before you try to understand the purpose of the writers. This one, Jesus cursed there is this incident when Jesus was going to the temple, and led to the cleansing of the temple, Matthew 21, verses 12 to 19, verses Mark 11, verses 12 to 14. When was the fig tree cursed by Jesus? Was it before or after the temple was cleansed? You read one incident saying Jesus actually cursed the fig tree on his way to the temple, as Mark said. But this does not mean that Matthew is wrong. Actually, to harmonize these 2 events, you just need to bear in mind that Jesus could have made 2 trips to the temple. And he cursed the fig tree on the 2nd trip. So in Mark 11, it says, Christ entered the temple the day of his triumphal entry. And when he enters the temple, Mark doesn't mention Jesus making proclamation about any wrongdoing. He just look, see. Then on the next day, it says, referring to the fig tree on the way to the temple on the 2nd day. So Mark would really have given indication. He went first day, look, see. On the next day, then he went and cursed the fig tree on the way to the temple. And then on that 2nd day, he overthrew everything in the temple. But Mark, what was 2 events in Mark? Matthew addressed 2 events as though they were one event. So this gives the impression of the first day, Christ entered the temple, drove out the buyer and seller, and then cursed the fig tree at the same time. So, but you see, what I want to say is, understanding scripture requires diligence. Giving the benefit of the doubt, because we are treating the scripture respectfully, reverently, as the word of God. And when you look a bit deeper, you find that there are ways to explain what seems to be apparent discrepancy. So I think, now one more item. When you read Jesus' entry in triumphal entry, they talk about Jesus requested the disciples to go to the village to get 2 donkeys, the mother and the foal. And then after that, they took the 2 donkeys and they rode on Jesus rode on the donkey. So the question is, did Jesus ride on the 2 donkeys or 1 donkey? Favorite lah, always big distract lah. No. See, scripture is so inconsistent. But you look at it carefully, whether you find that both animals were involved in Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem. Matthew does not say Jesus rode on both mother and the colt. He merely states that Jesus sat on the garments that the disciples had placed on the donkeys. And perhaps they placed some garments on the mother and the others on the colt. But Jesus actually sat on the garments that was placed on the young colt, you may say. So in that sense, Mark and Luke focus on the colt that Jesus rode on, while Matthew focused on the presence of the colt's mother. What is the reason? The reason is this: why not Jesus just take the colt and then just ride? Maybe because the colt has never been sat upon before. It may panic, it may be stubborn, so bring the mother along to calm, they will have a calming influence on the young colt. So again, you see, there could be answers if only we care to look at them more carefully. So one more item. How many demoniacs were healed? You read Matthew, there were 2 demoniacs came to Jesus, while in Mark and Luke, there was 1 demoniac. Well, when you have 2, there must be 1 now. And so Mark and Luke chooses to just focus on the 1 demoniac, probably for whatever reasons, like 2 angels and 1 angel at the tomb. The one more prominent got singled out and reported. The other one just assumed. Why you want to find all this? Sometimes I feel very, very, I've spent all this time and missed the real message of the Bible, I just point out to you some of the fairy hunting grounds. One more, concerning Luke 2:2, when it says the census was given during Quirinius' governorship. But Quirinius was not governor until AD 6. So was there a wrong timing? You can read all the journals, but what I want to say is, the way to understand this is how to blend history and the text. Quirinius was there earlier, suppressing a rebellion and entrusted authority by Augustus, so that he actually superseded effectively. He was the governor in the process, and then later he became actual governor. So you may say there are ways to harmonize this historical data if only we go and look at it. So now I have given you just a few examples where the critics point out so-called discrepancy. The little exercise I rushed through, and I hope you will read books like Encyclopedia of Bible Difficulties by Gleason Archer or Geisler. You can read them casually, take your time. You find that many answers will be given. Sure, I think sometimes we can be over-eager to want to resolve everything. We don't want to have this artificial harmonization. We are mindful of that. But at the same time, through our experience, we find that if you are willing to be objective and not just simply finding fault, pointing fingers, there are plausible, quite satisfactory solutions to harmonize this alleged discrepancy. Try it for yourself, and I suggest that maybe you will be less critical of the Bible after that. Thank you.